As Jim said, the topic today is huge. In preparing these remarks, I was confronted with a vast amount of material, and so inevitably, I've had to select a few ideas and a limited amount of reasoning to present in our brief amount of time. Basically, we've got all of human behavior and human morality to draw from, and so it's basically beyond what we can do comprehensively. Now, I've got a handout, and if you haven't got a copy of the handout, there are some extra copies, which I can either make available or you can get them later. The handout includes a copy of the third version of the Humanist Manifesto and 3 pages of quotes from various texts that I looked at but ended up on the cutting room floor. In other words, we didn't make it into the remarks I've prepared. What I have done is divided material into 4 parts. The first part is simply to introduce the way that we think and talk about morality. Secondly, I'd like to provide sort of a view of what is. Now, what is, in this case, I'm looking at human history, and David Cole is here representing the Davids, as I refer to them, David Cole and David Hume. And we're going to be presenting what is, and then hopefully making a bridge, however tenuous, to what ought to be in the third part. I conclude with some speculation and my candidate for what might be a unifying principle for secular morality, and one that could be used as a yardstick as we move into the future. So let's start with our examples. First of all, recently I received a copy of Minnesota Physician, and there was an article on climate change in which the following line was used. People in their physical environment are interdependent, and knowledge, in this case of climate change, is not morally neutral and demands action. That's an interesting use of the phrase, but a very common one. We often use the concept of morally to move something from what is to what ought to be. In other words, the data is there for climate change, and then the writer is implying that by attaching the word morally, we are impelled to action. And yet the morality in question goes undefined, unexplained, and unexamined. Similarly, the American Humanist Association on its letterhead says good without God. And quite clearly they feel that the word good does not require definition because they're going to be good without God, but that remains undefined. We freethinkers say that we are in favor of morality without superstition. Now, we're clear about what we reject. We reject the sources of morality such as the scripture, pulpit, tradition, dogma. But we are not clear, or not as clear, about what we actually embrace. Put it another way, I think that as freethinkers, if we're confronted with someone who assumes that without God, or scripture, or church, or faith, freethinkers must be amoral at best, and probably they're immoral. And we all reject that. We all believe at some level that we lead moral lives, and yet that morality often goes kind of unexamined. I'll go a little deeper. I think that if pressed in a serious conversation, each of us would affirm and believe that we lead good lives. We would be a bit awkward in defining that morality, but again, if pressed, we would affirm and believe that we behave with constant or at least adequate attention to honesty, justice, compassion, generosity, loyalty, etc. And that in the aggregate, this constitutes leading a good or moral life. However, I also contend that we would reserve the right to ourselves to define these terms. Let me explain. We might affirm and believe that we are honest, but we would reserve the right to forgive ourselves a little of what Hope Hicks would call a white lie, and skirt the truth in answering questions like, how many glasses of wine did you have? One of my favorite questions, by the way. Similarly, we might affirm and believe that we are generous, but of course, We cannot support every charity, respond to every solicitation, help every street person, and therefore we would reserve to ourselves the right to define what it constitutes to be generous. We can go on, but we get the point. How our morality, however real, is flexible and personal. Now, by the way, as an asterisk by this, I would like to say that there's nothing unique to freethinkers about this. I think that the latitude we use in interpreting or applying our morality is universal. We may have less dogma to rely upon and fewer priests to interpret morality for us, but we actually are in good company because every person of every faith or non-faith tradition reserves the right to define the terms themselves operationally. I'd like to try another example. If you see a person down on the street, and I've used crutches for a year now, so being down on the street is something that's pretty vivid for me. Anyway, you see someone down on the street, and then you see someone else go over and help them, and you instinctively respond to that was a good thing. Or conversely, you see somebody down on the street, and you see somebody walk by, not pay any attention to them. And we instinctively feel that this is bad. And this has to do with our instinctive feeling of affinity for the person that's down on the street. Small children exhibit the same sense of distress when a playmate is unhappy or frightened. They exhibit distress and they often attempt to comfort. And the children may extend that sense of connection to non-human animals or even to stuffed toys. They try to comfort them. Now, one might ask, but aren't the children just identifying with the distressed child or animal? And I would say yes, except that we have to strike out the word just, because that belittles what may be the key to all morality, that sense of connection. I believe we do not experience this instinctive moral valence, good and bad, because of anything we've been taught. It's interesting. It does not come from the parable of the Good Samaritan. In fact, I believe that in this case, as in many other cases, and we can address this further during the Q&A, religious morality, as taught by the parable of the Good Samaritan and many, many other parables, is based upon more basic, one might say, biological instincts. One of the themes that has emerged for me in an examination of secular morality is that religion serves to notice, clarify, document, teach, enforce, and preserve moral instincts. But the moral instincts are not of their authorship. They have come, I would argue, from evolution. Now, one final example before we move on to the next part of the talk. I'm on the board of directors of Protect Minnesota, which is a gun safety organization. I noticed that all the people that carry guns have avoided today's talk. I guess they know that I'm on that board. Anyway, at a recent board meeting, several new potential board members were introduced, including a rabbi and an imam. I asked the imam and the rabbi about the degree to which they represented their own personal views versus representing a community. Each stated clearly that they could not speak for all Jews or all Muslims. By the way, this is precisely what each of us would say or should say if asked if we were able to speak for all freethinkers, and good luck with that if you ever try to do it. Anyway, the imam went on to state that he felt that being part of a religious tradition meant that he could draw upon a degree of moral authority in serving on our board. Now, that raises an interesting question. Where does moral authority come from? I argued, and as I think most freethinkers would, that it does not come solely from the association with a faith community. And I went on to suggest that moral authority could be based upon or arise from commitment to a concept or cause, clarity of purpose, constancy over time, and showing up, being involved. So you can get moral authority from other sources than a faith community. This could provide rich material for us freethinkers to reflect upon. I think it likely that some of the moral authority of religious communities arises from their collective commitment to certain principles and ideals and the codification of those principles. That is, members of a church community are in a good position to know what they stand for, because what they stand for has been debated, articulated, written down, defended, and reiterated over time and space. So there's a clarity to what they stand for. We kind of lack that clarity as freethinkers. I think I'll skip a section in the interest of time. Well, then I won't skip it. It says, by the way, I think it's fair to regard the codification of moral tenets of a faith community as both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength, as I've indicated, because it gives them constancy of purpose over time and geography. The weakness arises from the inflexibility of the rules. Tom asked me, when looking at our handout, what happened to Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2, because I'm handing out number 3. In actual fact, one was written in the anybody know, 30s or 20s? And this, not 33. And the second one was written in 73. And what the one from the 30s went to in 73 was to a listing of all of the rights causes that were active in 1973. Civil rights, women's rights, freedom from undue oppression by authority, right to be at peace. And basically it became a document of its time. The third version is actually shorter even than the first, and it's trying to boil down to the principles that humanists would ascribe to. And critics of humanists point to this flexibility as a weakness, but humanists point to it as a strength. They believe that human experience is transformative, and what is moral one day may not be moral the next. One need look no further than slavery to satisfy that. Well, what is the evidence for secular morality? I think that we can get a good idea or clue or hint from observing history, but not history as a still photograph. We have to look at history as a dynamic, moving force. I also believe that when we look at secular morality, we will, as I've suggested, discover to some degree an evolutionary basis. Now, I'd like to take as a starting point what is called the moral arc. Now, the moral arc was introduced, at least in the common vocabulary, by Martin Luther King in 1965 during the March from Selma. And his actual quote was, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And as many of you know, he actually took that from an abolitionist of 130 years earlier, Theodore Parker, who had it in his sermons in 1853. And he said, Theodore Parker, when you go to the original quote, is almost identical, that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice. Now, much of what I'm talking about today is based upon the work of Michael Shermer, and this will be up here for people to take a look at, and I'll be referring to Shermer frequently. He talks about the moral arc. In his introduction, Shermer says the following: "In the moral arc, my aim is to show that the Reverends Parker and King were right, that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice. In addition to religious conscience and stirring rhetoric, however, we can trace the moral arc through science with data from many different lines of inquiry, all of which demonstrate that, in general, as a species, we are becoming increasingly moral." That's a surprise. As well, I argue that most of the moral development of the past several centuries has been the result of secular, not religious, forces, and that the most important of these that emerged from the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment are science and reason. Now, Shermer goes on to present several hundred pages of evidence, and you'll notice I'm going a cappella today, no PowerPoint. If I was using PowerPoint, you would now be treated to half an hour of evidence, but I will just summarize it by saying that he presents evidence of moral progress, decreases in violence, war, racism, misogyny, increases in freedom, democracies, women's rights, concerns about animal rights, etc., etc., etc. He has a graph that shows a decline in homicides from the year 1200 to the present, a decline in war deaths from prehistoric bands to the present day, progress in democratization over the last 200 years around the world. He even has sections on racial stereotypes and how they have softened and softened because they become less and less acceptable over hundreds of years. He has a figure that shows the abolition and criminalization of slavery dating back to 1117 AD to the present day. All of these graphs and all this data is extremely convincing. Michael Shermer's book is complemented by that of Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker, another book that will be up here for you guys to take a look at the end. Those of you, if any, I was just asking Tom about this, who attended the Freedom from Religion Foundation conference in Madison last September, will have met Steven Pinker. And as a matter of fact, the Free Thought Today that came out this week has a long and attractive article about Steven Pinker, and I'll leave this up here for people to take a look at. I believe that Steven Pinker got his hairstyle from my wife, or vice versa. But anyway, please take a look. Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker his work parallels that of Michael Shermer. If you're not familiar with him, well, in his Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, he provides another several hundred pages of evidence, and I won't go into that in any detail, but he does, in his preface, identify 6 trends which he presents as capturing the human experience over the last millennium. And I'll just summarize these very quickly. And he presents these as evidence of moral progress. Those are his terms. He talks about the transition from the hunting, gathering, and horticultural societies in which we've moved to cities and governments as a step in the direction toward moral progress. In other words, you can see the hunting and gathering communities living very much red of tooth and claw, as Darwin was accused of saying. From the late Middle Ages to the 20th century, European countries saw a 10 to 50-fold decrease in homicide. He then also cites the movements to abolish socially sanctioned forms of violence like despotism, slavery, dueling, judicial torture, superstitious killing, sadistic punishment, and cruelty to animals. And at the same time, he points to the arising over this millennium of the first stirrings of systemic pacifism, which never existed before. And then his last 3 are having to do with more recent times. The great powers have stopped waging war since World War II. Organized conflicts of all kinds, and this is very hard for people that follow the news to believe, but you have to understand our news is highly selected from around the world to show us as much blood as possible. That since the end of the Cold War in 1989, organized conflicts of all kinds, civil wars, genocides, repression by autocratic governments, and territorial attacks have declined throughout the world. He wrote this in 1911, so he didn't witness some of the things that have happened in the last couple of years, so we can talk about that. And then finally, he points to the revulsion against aggression on smaller scales, including violence against ethnic minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. And he points to the human rights movement, the civil rights movement, women's movement, children's movement, gay rights, on and on. So basically, these 2 authors point to a view of what is, a view of history, which shows a steady, not consistent, but steady increase in moral progress. Now, what Parker and King were referring to in the moral arc, and what Shermer and Parker are documenting, was that during the last millennium, while humankind acquired the luxury of rising above the daily grind of survival and shed some of its most magical thinking of religion, a great transformation has occurred. What has humankind done with its new freedoms? Well, King and Parker say that the moral arc spins toward justice, or you could say, in the words of these authors, that it bends toward decreased violence, increased cooperation, less warfare, less racism, less xenophobia, and less misogyny. Now, why would this occur? And what can it teach us about secular morality? Well, some may object to the term. I think it possible that the long arc, which is a trajectory, of course, not a single moment in time, humans are responding to some sort of natural instinct or natural law. Michael Shermer says emotions evolved to direct behavior toward our own survival and flourishing, and specifically moral emotions, and he lists guilt, shame, empathy, contempt, vengeance, and remorse, evolved to guide our behavior in interaction with others. In other words, what he's saying, and which many authors have said, including spectacularly E.O. Wilson, is that we not only have evolved on the basis of the survival of the fittest individual, but we've also evolved on the basis of the fittest group. And the fittest group may include, the things that drive or define the fittest group may include what we now see as moral progress. Okay, well, in a few minutes I'm going to now move to the third part of the talk. We're going to stay on time. Right, Jim, are we doing okay? Okay. In a few minutes I'll turn to an overview of some of the written codes, like the one that I handed out, for behavior for secularists. But first I want to deal with, or at least acknowledge, the naturalistic fallacy. Can we get to what ought to be from what is? What is, I'm convinced, is well described here and is not well described in your daily news feed. Well, your daily news feed would take you in an entirely different direction. It's basically intended to horrify you. Can we get to what ought to be from what is? Hume is portrayed as saying that we cannot, or at least that it's tricky. Now, on one level, Hume's assertion is obviously true, in that fact or science or observation exist in the physical world, the world that we can touch. While what ought to be, morality, exists in the subjective world of ideas, values, philosophy. This dichotomy is reinforced by the observation or truism that nature is morally neutral. In other words, when you observe nature, the very idea that we have of nature is that we don't think there's a bad butterfly or a good petunia. We actually regard nature as morally neutral. The predator that kills a nice little bunny is not doing a bad thing. It's doing what nature commands it to do, and we regard it as morally neutral. The idea of good and bad are entirely imposed by the observer. Now, this may be summarized as saying that nature is an amoral force that does not have and can never have a moral valence. Michael Shermer asks, my mentor here, asks, however, somewhat rhetorically and argumentatively, that if moral sense does not come from reality, where does it come from? So he's basically saying, get ready, we're going to talk about where it may come from. In reflecting on this, first let me... It seems to me that all established moral codes, be they religious or, as we will see shortly, secular sources, are made up. That is, they are constructs of what ought to be. Constructs of what ought to be may be said to be products of particular cultures or people or societies or organizations, telling us, in effect, how we ought to behave, imposing rules that are in the service of a particular power structure, world order, church, society, or ideology. Now, that is, I would say, by the way, you summarize that by saying that maybe no church or government or society has ever bridged the is, ought to gap, highlighted by the Davids, Cole and Hume. However, I think that this would be the most cynical and dismissive way to look at moral codes. In other words, I'm setting this up as a bit of a straw man because I don't believe that that's the correct way to understand moral codes. So that they cannot get to what ought to be. I mean, they cannot be based on what is. They have to be made up. In supporting this contention, I'd say make an interesting observation about moral codes and draw our attentions to the implications of the universality of the Golden Rule. We'll be dwelling on this for a while. First, somewhat obviously and distractingly, many moral codes include self-serving rules of conduct that serve to define who is in and out of a group. Kosher rules, honoring the Sabbath, no other gods before you. These, I think, can be dismissed as housekeeping rules that have little bearing on morality. In other words, anybody in the room who thinks that whether you eat fish on Friday is a moral issue, please raise your hand. No matter how much they're dressed up by the organization that presents them, they are not, in a sense, moral rules. However, moral codes also contain a set of principles that are more or less universal. As noted by David last month, many moral codes, or at least many that have been embraced by major religions, contain some variant of the Golden Rule. And this suggests to me that they are all responding to something that is shared by all humanity. In other words, cultures over time and over geography come up with the same rules. Well, why would they do that? And I would argue that it's probably based in natural selection. That part of what is the human being of today, which we share, of course, across all cultures because evolution operates so slowly, includes something that results in the Golden Rule. I believe that these principles, the prohibitions against killing, theft, and lying, the ones that are more or less universal, are universal because they are based on and reinforced by what, for want of a better term, we might call natural law. And I want to make sure I don't repeat myself. What I'm suggesting here is that evolutionary forces shaped us and included a selective advantage for groups that cooperated, groups that obeyed certain basic rules of conduct. We might call this the cooperation instinct, which has emerged and is emerging from ongoing natural selection to provide an advantage not only to the fittest individual, but to the fittest group, society, or culture. Well, I'd like to now digress for a little bit and give you some of the highlights from some of the moral codes that have been suggested by various sources. Where's Joe? Hi, Joe. Not all of these are from Joe. Several of them are from Joe, though, because Joe sent me some good material to work with. As I list these ideas, concepts, look for commonality. Look for what themes seem to emerge. First of all, our own group did some work on secular morality 2 years ago. We were convened by Joe, and we came up with a brief document that highlighted 4 domains of secular morality. The first was the interactions between people, and in that domain we cited, not exactly verbatim, but we certainly cited the concept of the Golden Rule. We also, another domain was an integrated biosphere, meaning that we are part of a natural world that contains within it certain responsibilities. We also included a domain having to do with, for want of a better word, humility. We talked about how vast time and space are and how short human existence has been, and therefore we were arguing a bit for humility. And then we had a final one that talked about temporal life and responsibility. That is to say, this is the only life we have, and we have to, in the words of the Army, be all we can be. Now, Joe sent me an essay by Elaine de Botton. Ellen de Botton. What Joe didn't know is that I would go ahead and buy his book, which is called Religion for Atheists, which is also going to be up here for people to take a look at. In his essay that's online, and all of you can find this online, called On Being Good, the Secular Virtues, he lists the following 10 ideas: resilience, empathy, patience, sacrifice, politeness, humor, self-awareness, forgiveness, hope, and confidence. Joe also sent me a copy of the Universalist Unitarian Congregation's Statement on Social Justice. And I might say that in this statement, social justice is essentially assumed to be a principle that we should aspire to. And in the service of social justice, the UUC statement emphasizes service, education, witness, by which they mean showing up, being there and being part of something, advocacy, and community organizing. Now, I've handed out the third version of the Humanist Manifesto, so I won't summarize that because you can take a look at that on your own time. But they touch upon humans being an integral part of nature, participation in the service of humane ideals, and working to benefit society. Now, the American Humanist Association's letterhead, the one that says good without God, is over a set of principles that the AHA came up with, and they include compassion, working for the greater good of humanity, affirming the dignity of every human being, and working for the welfare of the community. There's another summary in Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, but I'm conscious of our time, so I won't dwell on it very much, but he is for he lists what he calls motives that may orient people away from violence and toward cooperation and altruism, and he lists empathy, self-control, a moral sense which basically governs interactions among people, and reason. Now, these concepts and ideas about moral behavior, being good without God, tend to return again and again to several principles. You could probably list your own from having listened to this, but I would list compassion, fairness, and service for the greater good. But I challenge us, can we identify a single unifying principle and with that a direction for secular morality? And perhaps with that also a useful yardstick for measuring any particular idea, behavior, or policy. That's a pretty ambitious idea, to distill out from all these ideas a single theme which could then serve as a yardstick for the direction that we're going. So now we get to what I would call concluding remarks, and I think I'm still on time. Okay. In his introduction to the moral arc, Michael Shermer explains his goal. This book is descriptive in that it describes what has unfolded over time and as we become more moral, and it is prescriptive in that it describes what we ought to do if we want to continue the trend. And this is what I'd like to do in these last remarks. As we observe history, as summarized by Shermer and Pinker, we see a trajectory from the year 1000 to the year 1500 to the year 2000, and it's very easy to continue that trajectory forward into the future. If further we approve of the direction of this trajectory, less violence, more cooperation, we might conceive of where humankind ought to go if we're going to stay on the trajectory. And we might have a way of saying that we have a bridge from what is to what ought to be. There are a couple of leaps of logic there that I'm sure David Cole will help me with in a few moments. Let me put it another way. If the potential which we have inherited randomly is not yet fully expressed, the potential this is for cooperation. If the potential which we've inherited randomly is not yet fully expressed, not fully realized in society, in our social structure and in our interactions, what if evolution, natural selection, has created humans who are both selfish and social, and evolution has rewarded both the fittest individuals and the fittest groups, and under these rather plausible, to my way of thinking, circumstances, we might have the potential for both further individual maturation, if you will, further expression of our inherited potential, and our societies may also have the potential for further expression of our cooperation instinct. In this circumstance, you could see the slowly emerging social expression of our inherited instinct for cooperation. It is this slowly emerging social expression of our inherited instincts that might provide the key to secular morality. What is the trajectory that tracks the moral arc of history? I'll use the analogy of a pole star. You never get to a pole star, but you can use it to keep yourself on the right course and actually to measure how far you've progressed if you're going in a particular direction. My proposed pole star is the growth of empathy. In reflecting on the evidence provided by Schirmer and Pinker, I find that the umbrella that seems to cover the observed phenomena most satisfactorily is the growth of empathy. From kin to tribe, from tribe to community, including strangers, from community to nation, from nation to race, from race to all of humanity, from humanity to non-human animals, to all sentient beings, and even to the future, which is why we care about the environment, because we empathize with the people of the future. Empathy grows due to the hardwired natural selection, this is my contention, the hardwired natural selection which rewards cooperation and mutual support, and I have in support of that, I'm not exactly going to cite God, but I'm going to cite Darwin. In the long history of humankind and animal kind, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed, and the social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. In our own time, the growth of empathy, I think, is accelerated by cultural memes that operate much more rapidly than evolution. And those cultural memes disapprove of racism, sexism, speciesism, etc. So what does it all mean? Is it a castle in the air? In my notes at the beginning I said, if at the end of the talk people say, well, duh, that was obvious, then I will have succeeded because I will have taken something that's in our consciousness and made it overt. And people will say, well, duh, we knew that all along. That'd be good. But are we simply saying that my karma ran over your dogma? You know, the bumper sticker? Are we just saying that my karma, which is my instincts, my inherited instinct for cooperation, is more powerful and more helpful than your dogma? Well, maybe. But I believe that in the form of empathy, we could actually have something that's more powerful than that yet, a yardstick. And if you take the concept of empathy and then you measure things that are in your daily news, you can decide what valence they have in a moral sense. And I'd like to test this on 6 ideas, or 7. How does xenophobia stack up? How does racism stack up? Sexism or misogyny? Wealth and income disparities, how do they stack up? Environmental degradation. And lastly, one of my favorites, gun violence. How does this all stack up against our yardstick of empathy? And with that, I'd like to throw it open for Q&A.